Maya's jaw tightened as Claire's voice cut through the cabin, sharp and unwavering. "You're holding up the flight. Either find another seat or get off." The words landed like a slap, sudden and deliberate. The low hum of conversation that had filled the plane moments ago vanished. Heads turned, eyes flicking between Maya and Claire. Some looked curious, others irritated, a few openly exasperated, as if Maya were the one causing the delay. Taking a slow, measured breath, Maya squared her shoulders. "I paid for this seat," she said, her voice steady and firm. "I'm not moving." A murmur rippled through the rows. A teenage boy in row 12 lifted his phone, angling it to record. A black woman in row 18 folded her arms, her expression unreadable. Then, from the front of the plane, a calm but authoritative voice sliced through the tension like a blade. "This young lady has every right to sit in the seat assigned to her." Silence. A middle-aged man in a crisp charcoal suit stepped forward, his airline ID badge catching the light. The regional manager. Claire's face lost its color. "Sir, Enough." His tone left no room for argument. His gaze swept over the cabin before settling on Maya. "Miss, please take your seat. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." Maya exhaled, the weight on her chest lifting, just slightly. Then his eyes shifted back to Claire. His expression hardened. "As for you, we'll be discussing your employment status when we land." The reaction was immediate. A hushed ripple of disbelief spread through the plane. The businessman who had sighed dramatically earlier was suddenly staring at his hands. The teenage boy's phone stayed locked on the scene. And Claire? She just stood there, silent, stunned, as the reality of the moment crashed down on her. As Maya finally settled into her seat, the black woman in row 18 gave her a slow, deliberate nod, a silent acknowledgement. Justice had been served. Meanwhile, the airport buzzed with energy, a chaotic symphony of rolling suitcases, overlapping announcements, and hurried conversations. The air smelled of coffee, reheated airport food, and the faint scent of jet fuel. Travelers moved in every direction, some rushing, others waiting, all caught in the rhythm of transit. Maya Henderson, 16 years old, stood near her gate, gripping her boarding pass with slightly sweaty fingers. This was her first time flying alone. Though excitement bubbled in her chest, a nervous flutter settled deep in her stomach. Her parents had hugged her tightly before dropping her off. Her mother had squeezed her hand one last time, reminding her to text as soon as she landed. She had promised she would. But now, standing at gate B22, adjusting the strap of her backpack, the weight of being on her own truly settled in. She was flying to Charlotte to see her grandmother, someone she hadn't visited in nearly 3 years. Life had gotten in the way. School, schedules, the fact that flights weren't cheap. But her grandmother had insisted. "You're growing up too fast, baby," she had said over the phone. "Come let your Nana see you before you get too grown to visit." Maya had laughed, promising she would come as soon as she could. And now here she was, surrounded by strangers heading in the same direction but on entirely different journeys. As the boarding process began, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, handing her pass to the flight attendant at the gate. The woman barely glanced at her, scanned it, and waved her through. Maya walked down the jet bridge, her heart pounding slightly faster with each step. She was really doing this alone. Inside the plane, the air was crisp, with the scent of industrial cleaner and recycled oxygen. Flight attendants in navy blue uniforms stood at the entrance, offering mechanical smiles as passengers trickled in. Maya gave a polite nod, gripping her bag strap a little tighter as she moved down the aisle, scanning for 14B, a window seat. She liked the idea of watching the world shrink below her, but as she reached row 14, she hesitated. Someone was already sitting in her seat. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled button-up and worn-out sneakers sat comfortably, flipping through a magazine as if he belonged there. Maya frowned, double-checking her ticket. 40B, definitely hers. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice polite but firm. "I think you're in my seat." The man barely glanced up. He looked at her, then at the seat, and shrugged. "Not my problem," he muttered, turning a page. A slow burn of frustration crept up Maya's neck. She wasn't one to make a scene, but she had paid for this seat. Inhaling deeply, she pressed the call button above her head. A simple mix-up. That's all. A flight attendant would come, check their tickets, and clear everything up. She had no idea that pressing that button would set off a chain of events that would change everything. Maya barely had time to process the man's dismissive response before a flight attendant appeared. The woman moved with the brisk efficiency of someone used to dealing with impatient travelers. But there was something else in her posture, something sharper, more irritated, like she was already fed up before Maya even spoke. Her name tag read, Claire. She sighed loudly, planting a hand on her hip. "What now?" she asked, her tone clipped, as if Maya's very presence was an inconvenience. Maya swallowed the frustration rising in her chest and kept her voice steady. "I think there's been a mistake. This is my seat, but someone else is sitting in it. My ticket says 14B. She held up her boarding pass, expecting Claire to check the passenger list, confirm the error, and resolve the issue. But Claire didn't even glance at the ticket. She barely looked at Maya before rolling her eyes. "Maybe you should have checked your seat before boarding," she said, her voice thick with condescension. Maya blinked, momentarily thrown off. What? That didn't even make sense. She had checked. Multiple times. That's why she was standing here now. "I did," Maya said, keeping her voice measured. "I was assigned Fort B. That's what my ticket says." Claire exhaled sharply through her nose, unimpressed. "Then maybe you're mistaken." She turned toward the man occupying the seat and offered him a tight smile. "Sir, is this your seat?" The man barely looked up. "Been sitting here since I got on," he muttered, flipping another page in his magazine. Claire turned back to Maya, crossing her arms smugly. "See? He's been here. Maybe your seat is further back." Maya's pulse quickened. This wasn't right. Claire was dismissing her without even checking. She had seen flight attendants handle situations like this before, pulling up the seating chart, verifying tickets, making sure things were handled fairly. But Claire wasn't doing any of that. She wasn't even trying. Passengers nearby began to take notice. A woman across the aisle looked up from her phone. A teenage boy in row 12 nudged his friend, whispering. The energy in the cabin shifted, as if people could sense something was off. Maya steadied herself. "I know where my seat is," she said firmly. "I'd just like you to check." Claire scoffed. "Sweetheart, we're about to take off. I don't have time to play musical chairs with passengers who can't keep track of their own seats." Maya's stomach clenched. Passengers who can't keep track of their own seats. She wasn't imagining this. Claire wasn't just impatient, she was treating Maya as if she were the problem. And Maya had a sinking feeling she knew why. She took a steady breath, gripping her ticket tighter. "My ticket says 14B. I checked before boarding. I checked again when I got here. I didn't make a mistake." Her voice remained calm, but there was a sharper edge to it now. Claire let out an exaggerated sigh, crossing her arms. "You kids always think you can take whatever seat you want," she muttered just loud enough for Maya to hear. Maya's body went rigid, her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Across the aisle, a white businessman sighed dramatically, shaking his head as if this entire exchange was beneath him. "For God's sake, just sit down somewhere," he muttered, not even bothering to look at her. Maya's stomach twisted. She knew exactly what was happening. She had seen it before, felt it before. That unspoken assumption, that silent verdict, that she was the problem. It didn't matter that she had proof. It didn't matter that she had approached the situation politely. Claire had already decided she didn't belong here. Maya could feel the weight of the cabin pressing down on her. Some passengers watched with mild curiosity. Others avoided her gaze entirely, either too uncomfortable or too indifferent to care. She inhaled slowly, keeping her voice even. "I'm not trying to take someone else's seat," she said. "I just want the seat I was assigned." Claire huffed, shifting her weight. "Well, sweetheart, that seat's already occupied, so you can either take another one or step aside so we can keep boarding." Maya's jaw clenched. "I paid for this seat." Claire's mouth pressed into a thin, irritated line, her patience clearly gone. "What do you want me to do?" she snapped, gesturing toward the man in 14B, who was still flipping through his magazine like none of this involved him. "Drag him out of the chair?" Maya's hands curled into fists at her sides, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had been in situations like this before. She knew the unspoken rules. If she raised her voice, even if she was right, she would be seen as the aggressor. So instead she squared her shoulders and spoke with quiet determination. I want you to check the passenger list. If you do that, we'll see whose name is on this seat. Claire let out a humorless laugh. Oh, so now you're telling me how to do my job. Maya exhaled sharply through her nose, trying to push back the frustration rising in her chest. I'm just asking you to confirm what I already know. Claire narrowed her eyes, then glanced around the cabin as if waiting for someone to back her up. Across the aisle, Mr. Walker, the businessman, shook his head and muttered something under his breath. Near the front of the plane, an older black woman adjusted her glasses and watched carefully. Maya saw the way Claire flicked her gaze toward the woman, then quickly looked away. For a second, Maya thought Claire might actually check the list. Finally, do what she should have done in the first place. But instead, Claire turned back to her with a smirk. Maybe you should just be grateful there's a seat available at all. Maya's body tensed, and then Claire's voice rose, sharp and deliberate. You're holding up the flight. Either sit somewhere else or get off. The words hit like a slap. The low hum of casual conversation in the cabin died instantly. Every head within earshot turned toward them. Some eyes flicked between Maya and Claire with curiosity, others with irritation. A few with outright exasperation, like Maya was the one causing the problem. Heat rushed to her face. She wasn't being difficult. She wasn't demanding anything unreasonable. But Claire had framed the situation as if Maya was the problem, as if she was making a scene on purpose. And now, everyone on this plane was seeing her that way. From the back of the cabin, a voice murmured low but just loud enough for Maya to hear. A black woman in row 18, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, muttered under her breath, "This is exactly why I hate flying." Maya swallowed hard. She knew what the woman meant. She knew the exhaustion behind those words. 2 rows ahead, Jake, the teenage boy, lifted his phone just slightly, angling the camera. The faint glow of the screen reflected in his glasses. Maya didn't know if he was filming out of solidarity or for entertainment, but the knowledge that this moment could end up online made her pulse spike. Claire, emboldened by the passenger's silence, placed a hand on her hip. "What's it gonna be?" she pressed. "Because we don't have all day." Maya's fingers tightened around her boarding pass. Every instinct screamed at her to just sit down in another seat, to take the loss, to let it go. But she had done nothing wrong. She wasn't just going to disappear because Claire had decided she wasn't worth listening to. She lifted her chin. "I'm not moving," she said, her voice clear but controlled. Claire's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was a challenge. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some people shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen, but hanging on to every word. Others whispered to each other, watching the scene unfold like a slow-moving train wreck. Maya's hands felt clammy, but she refused to break eye contact. She had seen enough videos, heard enough stories. She knew how this usually ended. It would only take one more step from Claire, one call to security, one escalation, and suddenly she wouldn't just be a teenager in the wrong seat. She'd be a problem to be removed. She forced herself to breathe evenly. "I have a ticket for this seat," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm not leaving." Claire scoffed, throwing her hands in the air dramatically. "Oh, so now you think you can just do whatever you want?" She sneered. "That's not how this works, sweetheart." Maya could hear it now, loud and clear. That tone, that condescension. Across the aisle, Mr. Walker shook his head, muttering under his breath. Unbelievable. Near the front of the plane, an elderly woman leaned forward, watching the exchange closely. Maya caught her gaze for just a second. Something unreadable flickered in the woman's expression. Claire exhaled sharply, her patience completely gone. "I'm calling security," she snapped. "You can explain to them why you think you're special." A hush fell over the plane. The passengers who had been quietly spectating suddenly realized what was about to happen. In row 12, Jake adjusted his phone, angling it slightly better, as if anticipating a bigger moment. Maya's heart pounded against her ribs. This was spiraling, and she knew it. But she also knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to be the one to back down. Maya stood her ground, refusing to move an inch. "This isn't my mistake. It's the airlines," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. She wasn't going to be bullied into submission. Not when she knew she was right. Claire's expression darkened as she took a step closer, her voice dropping into something sharp and edged. "You're making a scene." Maya's hands curled into fists at her sides. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't being aggressive, but Claire was talking to her like she was out of control, like she was the one escalating this, when all she had done was ask for what she paid for. The murmur of passengers grew louder. A man in a business suit, Mr. Walker, sighed heavily and rubbed his temples, visibly annoyed. A flight attendant near the galley hesitated, looking between Claire and Maya, but she didn't step in. No one did. Maya swallowed hard against the lump rising in her throat. She knew this game. She had seen it play out too many times, on the news, in stores, in schools. Someone like her standing firm, refusing to shrink, and suddenly, they became the aggressor. Claire crossed her arms. "You think you can just argue your way into first class?" A few passengers gasped. A woman near the front let out a sharp breath, shaking her head in disbelief. The words hung in the air like poison, thick, unmistakable. Maya's entire body went cold. There it was. No more subtle dismissiveness. No more passive condescension. That was racism, out in the open, daring her to react. Jake's phone zoomed in, the glow of the screen illuminating Claire's rigid posture, her smug expression, the way she towered over Maya like she was dealing with an unruly child, rather than a paying customer. Maya felt her throat tighten. Not with fear, with rage. She saw the smirk on Mr. Walker's face as he shifted in his seat, like he had been expecting this all along. She saw Ms. Green in row 18 shake her head, her eyes burning with exhaustion. But not surprise. She saw the elderly woman near the front, her lips pressed together in disapproval, but still saying nothing. Maya sucked in a breath. "I never said anything about first class," she said, her voice measured but cold. "I just asked for my seat, the one I was assigned." Claire let out a sharp laugh, glancing around the cabin as if waiting for someone to back her up. Mr. Walker snorted, "Just let it go, kid. It's a seat." Maya turned toward him, her eyes burning. "Then why is it such a problem for me to sit in it?" He stiffened, but he didn't say a word. Claire took another step forward, crowding into Maya's space. "I'm done arguing with you. Either take another seat, or get off my plane." Maya felt a surge of white-hot anger at those words. Her plane. As if she owned it, as if Maya didn't belong here. She didn't care who was watching. She didn't care that her legs were shaking beneath her. "I'm not moving." Her voice was steady, unshaken. The plane fell silent. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Claire pulled out her radio, her voice clipped. "I need security at row 14 immediately. I have an uncooperative passenger." Maya's breath came fast and shallow. Claire spoke into the radio with the same professional detachment someone might use to report a broken seatbelt or a spilled drink. Like this was routine. Like she was handling an actual disturbance. But Maya wasn't causing a problem. She was asking for what was rightfully hers. Maya forced her voice to stay firm. "I want to speak to a supervisor." Claire smirked. "I don't have time for this." She turned toward the front of the plane, lifting her chin, already deciding she was done listening. Maya's skin burned with frustration. The weight of a dozen eyes pressed against her. And she knew. She knew exactly what was coming next. The weight of the passengers. Stares bore into Maya. Some watched with curiosity. Others with thinly veiled irritation. She knew what some of them were thinking. Another loud black girl making a scene. Another difficult passenger who just won't follow the rules. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She could feel it happening, the shift, the narrative twisting against her. And then a new presence filled the cabin, the pilot. He stepped out from the cockpit, his crisp uniform and no-nonsense stance making it clear he was here to settle things. His eyes landed on Claire first, then flicked to Maya with cool detachment. "What's going on?" His voice was calm, authoritative. Claire straightened, snapping into full professional mode as if she hadn't just been sneering moments ago. "This young lady refuses to take a seat," she said smoothly. "I've given her multiple options, and she refuses to cooperate." Maya's mouth dropped open. "That's not what happened." "That's not true," she said, gripping her ticket. "This is my seat. I have a ticket." The pilot held up a hand, cutting her off like she was an unruly child. Maya's fingers curled into a fist. He turned to Claire. "You asked her to move?" Claire nodded solemnly. "Multiple times. She refused." Then, with an exaggerated sigh, she added, "She's being difficult." Maya took a step forward, her ticket still clutched tightly in her hand. I am not being difficult, she said, her voice clear but controlled. I was assigned this seat. Look at my ticket, just check the passenger list. The pilot exhaled through his nose, like she was an inconvenience, like he had already made up his mind. Miss, he said, his voice cold, if you can't follow instructions, we can remove you from the flight. Maya's world tilted. The murmuring passengers, the cold, stale air, the low hum of the engines, everything blurred, like the ground had been ripped out from under her. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. She had done everything right. She had stayed calm. She had asked politely. She had not raised her voice. And yet, the moment authority stepped in, it was Claire they sided with, without even checking. Maya's breath hitched. Panic swelled in her chest, rising like a tidal wave. She had seen this before. Too many times. A black person refuses to comply, even when they're right, and suddenly they're labeled aggressive, hostile, uncooperative. Security comes, maybe the police, and suddenly they're dragged off the plane. Plastered all over the news. Just another viral video of someone being forcibly removed for daring to speak up. Maya swallowed hard. She would not let them twist this. She would not let them make her the villain. She forced herself to breathe, to think. She met the pilot's gaze, pushing down every ounce of fear clawing its way up her throat. I am following instructions, she said, her voice steady. I was told to sit in my assigned seat. This is my assigned seat. I'm not the one breaking the rules. The pilot's expression hardened. Miss, Maya lifted her chin. Are you really about to remove a paying passenger without even checking the manifest? The silence in the cabin stretched, thick, suffocating. The tension so heavy it pressed down on everyone. Maya braced herself for the worst, and then, a voice cut through the air. Clear, unwavering. This is wrong. Maya's head snapped toward the front of the plane. An elderly woman, dressed in a neatly pressed beige cardigan and pearls, had turned in her seat. Her sharp eyes locked onto Claire. Not with anger, with disappointment. The girl is only asking for what she paid for, she said, her voice carrying through the cabin with the kind of authority that demanded attention. She isn't causing trouble. She isn't raising her voice. She just wants her seat. Maya swallowed hard. A lump formed in her throat. Claire's eyes flared with something ugly, like she had just been betrayed. Mind your own business, she snapped, her voice laced with irritation. A ripple of shock moved through the passengers. A few gasps. A murmur of disbelief. The elderly woman's lips pressed into a thin line. Excuse me? Maya could almost hear the sharp inhale of Mr. Walker across the aisle. The same man who had rolled his eyes earlier. His smug detachment cracked slightly. His posture stiffened. His face twitched with something close to embarrassment. As if suddenly, being on the wrong side of this moment had just become real for him. For the first time, Claire looked rattled. Mrs. Caldwell sat up straighter, undeterred by the venom in Claire's glare. I've been flying for 50 years, she said coolly. And I have never seen a flight attendant speak to a passenger like this. Never. Claire's mouth opened, then closed, her face turned red. Maya held her breath. This was the first time anyone had spoken up for her. For a split second, Claire hesitated, as if she had finally noticed the weight of the eyes on her. Across the aisle, Mr. Walker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. In row 12, Jake zoomed in even closer. In row 18, Ms. Green nodded approvingly, arms still crossed, but her expression softened slightly, as if to say, finally. Claire's jaw clenched. She turned toward Captain Owens, as if silently pleading for backup, but he just stood there, arms crossed, expression unreadable. And in that moment, Maya saw it, the flicker of hesitation in Claire's face. Brief, but there. She had lost control of the narrative. Maya exhaled slowly, fingers still clenched around her ticket. She didn't know if Mrs. Caldwell's words would change anything. But for the first time since this nightmare started, she didn't feel alone. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to take a slow, measured breath. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. But she refused to let it crush her. She knew exactly what was happening, and she had two choices. She could give in. Let Claire win. Let these people think they were right about her, that she was just another difficult passenger, another black girl causing a scene, or she could stand her ground, even if it cost her everything. Her pulse pounded in her ears, the air in the cabin felt thick, suffocating. Too many unspoken words, too many judging stares. Across the aisle, Mr. Walker suddenly looked less confident in his stance. Jake's phone was still locked on her, capturing every second, and in the back, Ms. Green gave the smallest nod. Do what they don't expect you to do. Maya chose to stand. Her voice was clear, unwavering. I'm not moving. I have the right to be here. The plane went silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the engines. Captain Owen's gaze hardened. His mouth pressed into a tight line. Claire exhaled sharply. Her patience snapped. Fine, she spat. You want to make this difficult? Then we'll make it difficult. She turned to the pilot, her eyes gleaming with triumph. I already called security. She can explain herself to them. Maya's stomach twisted, but she refused to let the panic show on her face. Before she could speak, Mrs. Caldwell's voice rang out again, louder this time. This is outrageous. She turned toward the pilot, her voice sharp with disbelief. The girl is just asking you to check the manifest. You're really going to call security before even confirming the mistake? Claire didn't even turn to look at her. She wasn't backing down. But the mood in the cabin had changed. The businessman who had sighed so dramatically earlier suddenly looked uncomfortable, as if realizing this was no longer just an inconvenience. Maya felt her heartbeat steady, her resolve locking into place. She turned, stared directly at Captain Owens. If security comes, that's on you, she said, voice firm. But before they do, I want you to answer one question. The pilot hesitated. What? Maya lifted her ticket, holding it firm. Are you really about to remove a paying passenger without checking the manifest first? Silence. A shift in energy. Passengers exchanged glances. Some leaned in closer, waiting. Jake zoomed in, capturing the moment. The power had shifted. Captain Owens pressed his lips into a tight line. He exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. And for the first time, Claire looked nervous. Then, a deep voice sliced through the thick tension. That won't be necessary. Head snapped toward the front of the plane. A man in a sharp navy suit stepped forward, his expression unreadable. His airline badge gleamed under the cabin lights. Daniel, the regional manager. Maya barely had time to process his presence before he spoke again, his voice steady, firm, laced with authority. Miss Henderson, I sincerely apologize. Please stay seated. I'll handle this. The entire plane seemed to freeze. Claire's mouth fell open. The pilot stiffened. Passengers who had been mere spectators moments ago leaned in closer, sensing the shift. The balance of power had just changed. The energy in the cabin had shifted. Jake's phone remained locked on the scene, recording every second. Maya's breath hitched. He knew her name. Daniel turned his gaze toward Claire, his expression cold, unreadable. Claire, step aside. Her face paled. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but then quickly shut it. Her throat worked as she swallowed. Across the aisle, Mr. Walker, the businessman who had dismissed Maya earlier, suddenly looked thoroughly uncomfortable. He adjusted his tie, shifted in his seat, as if he had just realized he had chosen the wrong side. Near the front, Mrs. Caldwell sat up straighter, her lips curving into the slightest hint of satisfaction. In row 18, Ms. Green exhaled slowly, shaking her head. But this time, it wasn't just frustration, it was understanding. Claire finally found her voice. Sir, you were just about to have a paying passenger removed for questioning an obvious mistake. Daniel cut in smoothly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Without checking the manifest, without following protocol, without showing an ounce of professionalism. Claire's face turned red. Maya felt her heart finally start to slow. The adrenaline was still in her veins, but for a different reason. Daniel's attention never wavered from Claire. I heard everything. He glanced toward the cockpit, and so did Captain Owens. A sharp gasp rippled through the cabin. Claire froze. Passengers exchanged glances. Even the pilot's stern exterior cracked. His eyes flicked toward Daniel, wary. Daniel crossed his arms. We have policies in place for situations like this. You ignored them. You escalated a simple issue into a public spectacle. His gaze darkened, and you made it personal. Claire's hands trembled. You're done. The words hit the cabin like a shockwave. Passengers murmured. Jake's camera zoomed in. Mr. Walker stared at his lap, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Claire's face drained of color. Her lips trembled as she turned to Daniel, then to the pilot, silently pleading for backup, but no one spoke, no one moved. Daniel took a step closer, lowered his voice, just enough for only her to hear. You don't get to treat passengers like this, not on my airline. Claire swallowed hard. For the first time since this ordeal started, she looked afraid. The plane was silent. Then, in one final humiliating moment, Claire turned, grabbed her bag, and walked off the plane. She let out a nervous, breathy laugh. Her eyes darted around the cabin, as if expecting anyone to come to her defense. "You can't be serious," she scoffed, her voice pitching higher. Daniel didn't hesitate. His voice was firm, unwavering. "Not just over this. Over every passenger you've mistreated. Pack your things. You're fired." The weight of his words crashed down like a hammer. Claire blinked rapidly, as if she had misheard. "Fired?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Maya didn't move, didn't speak. She was too afraid that if she so much as blinked, this moment, this long overdue justice, would disappear. Mr. Walker, the same man who had sighed dramatically earlier, was now staring at his hands, his face, once smug, now empty. Jake stood frozen, his phone still recording. In row 18, Miss Green gave the smallest nod, not in celebration, but in recognition. Claire took a shaky step forward, her voice desperate now. "Daniel, wait, I was just doing my job." She was being. Daniel's sharp gaze cut through her excuses. "Your job?" he scoffed. "Your job was to de-escalate a minor issue. Instead, you turned it into a power play. Instead of helping a passenger, you humiliated her. You ignored policy. You ignored basic human decency." A murmur spread through the cabin. The tension shifted again. This time, fully against Claire. Her face turned a deep shade of red, whether from anger, humiliation, or both. She turned to the pilot. Her last chance at an ally. "Captain, say something. You saw what happened." Captain Owens hesitated. He had been willing to let Maya be removed. He had been willing to let security handle it. But now, with the airline's regional manager standing here, with cameras rolling, with the entire plane watching, he wasn't willing to risk his job for Claire's mistake. His jaw tightened. His voice was low. "I think it's best you listen." Claire's mouth fell open, but no words came out. The passengers, once silent spectators, now openly watching her downfall. And for the first time in her career, Claire had nothing left to say. Claire's mouth opened, but no words came out. Passengers shifted. Some exchanged quiet glances. Others openly stared at her with thinly veiled judgment. Across the aisle, Mr. Walker, the same businessman who had dismissed Maya earlier, he couldn't meet anyone's gaze. A deep silence settled over the plane. Maya exhaled slowly, realizing she had been holding her breath. Claire's hands shook as she grabbed her bag from the overhead compartment. She didn't look at Daniel. She didn't look at Maya. She didn't look at anyone who had just witnessed her downfall. Her steps were robotic, her face a mixture of shock and fury. And then, with nothing left to say, she walked off the plane. Her grip tightened around the handle of her bag, her knuckles white, her face flushed with humiliation. She avoided looking at anyone, her movements stiff, mechanical, as if she could somehow shrink herself out of existence. But there was no escaping this. The plane was silent for a long, heavy moment. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single clap, then another, and another. A slow, deliberate ripple of applause moved through the cabin. Not everyone joined in, but enough did. Enough to make Claire's entire body go rigid. Enough to let her know that this wasn't just an unfortunate misunderstanding. She'd been wrong, and everyone knew it. Maya didn't clap. She just watched, her heart pounding in her chest as Claire slowly turned toward the aisle, her shoulders drawn in tight, her face frozen, somewhere between shock and disbelief. Mr. Walker, the same man who had sighed so dramatically at the beginning, now sat rigid in his seat, eyes glued to his phone screen, as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. He wouldn't look at Maya, wouldn't even glance in her direction. Maya wondered if he felt embarrassed, if he realized what he had done. How easily he had dismissed her, before the tides had turned. Claire took a hesitant step forward. Then, as if remembering her dignity, she lifted her chin slightly and walked down the aisle, trying to pretend she wasn't hearing the claps, the whispers, the weight of dozens of eyes watching her final moments in uniform. Maya didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. She just felt tired. As Claire neared the exit, Mrs. Caldwell, the woman who had spoken up for Maya, gave a small, deliberate shake of her head, not cruel, not gloating, just disappointment. Claire hesitated for the briefest of seconds. Then, she stepped through the open door and disappeared. Daniel turned back to the cabin, his expression calm, composed. "We appreciate your patience," he said evenly. "We will be continuing our flight shortly." And just like that, it was over. The applause faded. Passengers adjusted in their seats. Some pretended like they hadn't been watching the entire time. Others snuck one last look at Maya before turning away. Jake, the boy with the phone, grinned at her, then put his device down. Maya let out a slow breath and sank into her seat. 14B. She had won. So why did it still feel so damn heavy? She sat there, her body sinking into the stiff cushion, as the weight of everything crashed over her at once. Relief, shock, guilt, power. Her mind spun in every direction, emotions colliding too fast to process. She had fought for herself, refused to be dismissed, refused to shrink, and yet, the victory didn't feel clean. It felt heavy, exhausting, complicated. The plane's atmosphere was different now, charged with something unspoken. Some passengers were still whispering, their eyes flicking toward her, when they thought she wasn't looking, but she saw them, and she knew. None of them would forget this flight. Some passengers kept glancing at her when they thought she wasn't looking, others avoided her gaze altogether, as if pretending this had never happened would somehow erase it. Then, a warm hand wrapped around hers. Maya startled slightly, turning toward the aisle. Ms. Green from row 18 stood beside her, her eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude, something like recognition. "You have no idea how much I needed to see that today," she whispered. She squeezed Maya's hand once, then pulled away. Maya swallowed hard. She didn't trust herself to speak. She could only nod. Miss Green gave her a knowing look before returning to her seat. But Maya felt the weight of her words settle deep in her chest. This wasn't just about her. From the front, Mrs. Caldwell caught Maya's eye and gave her a small, approving nod. It wasn't just kindness, it was acknowledgement. A silent way of saying, "I see you. I saw all of it." Maya's throat tightened. She wanted to thank her, but the words stuck, tangled in the storm still raging inside her. Across the aisle, Mr. Walker was suddenly very interested in his in-flight magazine. He hadn't spoken a word since Claire had been fired. Now, he shifted uncomfortably, flipping a page without actually reading it. Maya exhaled slowly. For the first time since stepping onto this plane, she felt seen. But she also knew this moment wouldn't last. The whispers would fade, the businessman would go back to his life, pretending he had been neutral all along. But she wouldn't forget. And somehow, she knew, neither would they. Maya barely noticed the rest of the flight. The hum of the engines, the occasional crackle of the intercom, the murmured conversations, it all blurred together. She stared out the window, watching the sky shift from deep blue to streaks of orange and pink as they neared Charlotte. Her fingers tapped against her armrest, her thoughts tangled in the weight of what had just happened. She didn't even realize how much time had passed. Until the pilot's voice came over the speaker, announcing their descent. The plane jolted slightly as the wheels extended. The familiar pressure of altitude change made her ears pop. She reached for her phone out of habit, unlocked the screen without thinking, and then she saw it. Her notifications were exploding. Messages, missed calls, mentions. Her stomach tightened. She clicked on one of the alerts, and the first thing that popped up was a video. A video of her. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She tapped the screen. And suddenly, she was watching herself through someone else's phone. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. She saw Claire standing over her sneering. She saw herself, calm but firm, refusing to move. She heard Claire's voice, sharp and cutting. "You think you can just argue your way into first class?" The caption beneath the video read, "Flight attendant tries to humiliate black teen over a seat, gets fired instead." Maya's fingers trembled as she scrolled. The video had been uploaded less than an hour ago, and it was already everywhere. Retweets, shares, comments flooding in faster than she could read. Her heart pounded as she saw the headlines. Teen stands her ground against discriminatory flight attendant. Airline fires employee mid-flight after racist incident. Another day, another viral travel nightmare. She swallowed hard. This wasn't just a moment anymore. It was a story, a national conversation, and she was in the center of it. Maya's thumb hovered over the screen as she scrolled. Reactions ranged from outrage to praise, to the inevitable skepticism. Some people were furious on her behalf, calling for accountability, demanding airlines do better. Others dissected every second of the video. debating whether Claire's actions had been explicit racism or just bad customer service. A few even tried to defend her, saying maybe she was just having a bad day. Maya frowned. Was this really just one bad day? Had Claire done this before? Had other passengers complained? Had there been warnings? Or had she been allowed to act like this for years, until today when she finally pushed too far? Or worse, was this really the first time? Had Maya just ruined someone's career over a single mistake? The thought made her stomach twist. But then she remembered. Claire made her choices. Claire chose to dismiss her without checking the manifest. Claire chose to humiliate her in front of an entire plane. Claire chose to escalate instead of fix a simple mistake. Claire chose to treat Maya like a problem instead of a paying customer. Maya exhaled. Her fingers tightened around her phone. This wasn't about one bad moment. This was about power. Claire thought she had it, thought she could get away with it, but she hadn't. And now, the whole world knew it. Maya's stomach twisted. But then she remembered. Claire made her choice. She chose to dismiss Maya without checking the manifest. She chose to humiliate her in front of the entire plane. She chose to escalate instead of fix a simple mistake. She chose to treat Maya like a problem instead of a paying customer. Maya exhaled. Her fingers tightened around her phone. This wasn't about one bad moment. This was about power. Claire thought she had it. Thought she had the authority, the backing, the right to treat Maya however she wanted. She had expected to get away with it, but she hadn't. Maya put her phone down, stared out the window as the city lights of Charlotte came into view. The weight of the entire experience pressed against her chest. Heavy, but clarifying. Claire wasn't a victim. She was just someone who had finally faced the consequences of her own choices. Maya took a deep breath as the plane touched down. The wheels hit the runway with a soft thud. Around her, passengers stirred in their seats, stretching, reaching for their bags, ready to move on as if nothing had happened. But Maya knew better. This moment, her moment, wasn't over. She glanced at her phone one last time. The notifications were still rolling in. People weren't just talking about what happened. They were feeling it. Some shared their own stories of being dismissed, belittled, ignored. Others asked the same question that burned in her mind. How many times had this happened before the cameras were rolling? And now, she wanted to ask you, have you ever experienced discrimination like this? Have you ever been made to feel like you didn't belong, even when you knew you did? What would you have done in Maya's place? Would you have fought back? Would you have stayed quiet? Would you have let it go, just to avoid conflict? Or would you have stood your ground, even knowing the risk? Because this wasn't just about a seat on a plane. This was about how people are treated. And who gets to decide? Maya hadn't been loud, hadn't been aggressive, hadn't done anything wrong. But still, Claire had spoken to her like she was a problem to be removed. The pilot had taken her side without question. The businessman had dismissed her before he even heard the full story. And that's how it happens. Discrimination doesn't always come as slurs or outright violence. Sometimes it's a tone, a look, a refusal to acknowledge that you even deserve basic respect. Sometimes it's being told you're overreacting when you know damn well you're not. And sometimes it's someone like Claire, realizing too late that her power wasn't absolute. Maya hadn't just fought for herself, she had fought for everyone who had ever been told to sit down and take it. And this time, the world saw it. Maya stood in the aisle, waiting for the line of passengers ahead of her to start moving. The plane doors had just opened. People were already shuffling forward, eager to get off, eager to continue their lives. But Maya knew. Her life wasn't the same as when she boarded this flight. She had come onto this plane as just another traveler, excited to visit her grandmother. Now she was walking off as a symbol of something much bigger. A moment that forced people to see what so many experience every day. Because racism doesn't always come as slurs. It doesn't always come as screaming or outright hatred. Sometimes it comes as a sigh, a dismissive tone, a refusal to check the facts. Because someone has already decided you don't matter. It comes as a flight attendant who won't even consider she could be wrong. A pilot who assumes you're the problem before you've even spoken. A businessman who sees your struggle as nothing more than an inconvenience. It's in the way people expect you to give up, to shrink, to let it go. And it's in the way, the moment you don't, you suddenly become the one making a scene. But standing your ground, refusing to be dismissed, speaking your truth, even when your voice shakes, that's how real change happens. Maya knew this wouldn't be the last time something like this happened. Not to her, not to someone else. But she also knew that every time someone stood up, it became harder for the world to ignore. And now, the story was out. The video was spreading, the conversation was happening. So what happens next? That's up to you. This is the moment of impact. Maya's story isn't just hers anymore. It belongs to everyone watching. Everyone who has ever been dismissed, been silenced, been told to shrink. Now, the question isn't what Maya will do next, it's what you will do next. This story grabs you from the first moment and never lets go. It starts with a simple misunderstanding, a seat mix-up. Something that happens on flights every day. But instead of a quick fix, it spirals into something much bigger, something heavier, something real. The high-paced conflict keeps the audience engaged. From the moment Maya presses the call button, tension builds. Every interaction escalates. Claire doesn't just ignore her, she dismisses her. The conflict grows with every word, every glance, every assumption. The stakes keep rising, and the audience feels it happening. The strong emotional pull makes this story real. Anyone who has ever been ignored, dismissed, underestimated, will feel this moment deep in their bones. Maya's quiet frustration, the feeling of being judged before she even speaks, the humiliation of being told she's making a scene when she's just asking for basic respect. It's all too familiar. The reactions from other passengers make it painfully clear. Some look away, pretending they don't see. Some assume she's in the wrong without question. Some stay silent, even when they know the truth. This isn't just about one flight, it's about real life. Then comes the explosive justice moment. Claire thinks she has all the power, she's wrong. The moment Daniel steps in, the power shifts. Claire, who thought she was untouchable, is held accountable in front of everyone. The audience watches her, squirm, deny, and finally, crumble. The injustice doesn't just get called out, it gets corrected. The moment she hears, "You're fired," is the moment every viewer breathes a sigh of relief. But this story isn't just about one plane ride, it's about the world watching. By the time the plane lands, the conversation is already happening. The video is spreading, people are debating. And suddenly, this isn't just about Maya. It's about every person who has ever been in her position. It sparks a conversation about power, privilege, and who gets believed. And that's what makes this story powerful. It's not just about what happens on the plane, it's about what happens next. And that's up to you. Will you keep silent, like so many passengers did? Or will you stand up like Maya did? Because every time someone speaks up, it becomes harder for the world to ignore. So now what happens next? That's up to all of us. The story doesn't end here. It's just beginning.